November 11, 1942. In the jagged remains of the Red October factory at 5 a.m., the air was so thick with the smell of death and cold iron that it felt solid enough to touch. For the Soviet soldiers clinging to the west bank of the Volga, the geography of their world had shrunk to a terrifying degree. Behind them lay the frozen expanse of the river, a treacherous lifeline where German artillery and Luftwaffe strikes turned every supply ferry into a floating coffin. In front of them, barely 50 yards away, lay the remnants of the German Sixth Army, a force that had conquered half of Europe and now stood poised to deliver the final blow to the Soviet heartland. To the men in the foxholes, the sky was a permanent slate of ash, lit only by the orange bursts of mortar fire and the sickly green glow of flares. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the decimated 62nd Army from a bunker dug into the riverbank, knew his men were fighting for minutes rather than miles. He had ordered his troops to HUD the enemy, to stay so close to the German lines that the feared Stuka dive bombers couldn't hit the Soviets without killing their own men. This was the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, where battles were fought for single rooms, for the charred remains of a kitchen, or for a pile of rubble that used to be a stairway. Every basement was a fortress, every sewer pipe a trench. There was no front line in the traditional sense, only a chaotic mosaic of violence, where a soldier might find an enemy in the room directly above him or behind the very wall he leaned his weary back against. The German soldiers, led by the stoic General Friedrich Paulus, were equally exhausted, yet they were fueled by the belief that the was in sight. To them, the Soviets were trapped against the water like cornered animals, their backs to a wall they could not climb. By 2 p.m., on that bitter afternoon, German pioneers had launched another massive assault, using flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear the last pockets of resistance in the industrial districts. To the high command in Berlin, the city was practically won. Hitler had already announced to the world that Stalingrad had fallen in all but name, and the maps in the German headquarters showed the Soviet holdings as nothing more than thin, bleeding slivers of gray on the river's edge. The German Sixth Army, once a symbol of lightning war, had become a massive, wounded beast, throwing its entire weight against the ruins, unaware that it was bleeding out in the process. Yet, beneath this surface of certain defeat, something else was stirring. While the 62nd Army suffered in the ruins, bleeding the German Sixth Army white in a meat grinder of urban combat, a massive silence was being manufactured hundreds of miles to the north and south. The deferrers in the ruins didn't know it yet, but their suffering was the bait in the greatest trap in military history. For every Russian soldier who died in a basement at 3:15 p.m. Stru, 10 more were being marshaled in the distant steppes, hidden by the winter mists and the strict silence of Operation Uranus. The Soviets were building a hammer of millions, while the anvil in Stalingrad took blow after blow, cracking but never fully shattering. The soldiers in the ruins felt the weight of the entire world pressing down on their chests. They were starving, frost-bitten, and low on ammunition, surviving on a few grams of hard bread and the grim determination that they would not be the ones to let the enemy reach the water. They were surrounded by fire and steel, cut off from their comrades and their homes, yet they held. They held because they had nowhere else to go. They were the thin red line that kept the German war machine from breaking through to the oil fields of the Caucasus. The legacy of these moments on the brink of collapse is one of the most haunting chapters of human history. It reminds us that even when all seems lost, when the shadow of total defeat looms largest, the tide can turn in ways that the powerful often fail to foresee. The ruins of Stalingrad became a monument not to victory, but to the sheer, stubborn endurance of the human spirit in the face of total annihilation. It was here, in the cold and the dark, that the fate of the 20th century was decided, not by grand maneuvers on a map, but by the desperate will of men who refused to believe they were already beaten. The silence that followed the heavy guns at the end of the day wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet indrawing of breath before a storm that would swallow an entire empire whole. It is a reminder that the cost of survival is often measured in the blood of those who stand their ground when the world tells them they have already lost. In the ruins, the Soviet soldiers were the masters of a graveyard, but little did they know they were preparing to bury the invaders in it. November 1942, along the frost-covered ravines of the Don and Volga rivers, a silence descended that was far more dangerous than the roar of any German artillery barrage. While the world watched the brutal room-to-room meat grinder inside Stalingrad, a colossal invisible hand was moving pieces across a chessboard that stretched for hundreds of miles. This was the birth of Maskirovka, the Soviet doctrine of total strategic deception, and it was about to change the course of human history. To the German generals, the Red Army was a broken force, a collection of ragged survivors clinging to the riverbank. But in the darkness, out of sight of the Luftwaffe's eagle eyes, the Soviet Union was building a hammer of such magnitude that it would shatter the backbone of the Wehrmacht. The sheer scale of this secret buildup was a logistical miracle. From the middle of October until the middle of November, the Soviets moved over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 13,000 artillery pieces into position. All of this was done with a level of discipline that bordered on the supernatural. Troops moved only during the hours of darkness. At 6 p.m. each night, the quiet steppes would suddenly erupt into a hive of activity as columns of trucks and horse-drawn wagons surged forward. By 5 a.m. the next morning, as the first gray light touched the horizon, every single man, vehicle, and gun vanished. They were hidden in deep ravines covered by white sheets or tucked away in hollowed-out haystacks that looked like nothing more than harmless farm debris from the air. Even the bridges across the Volga were part of the grand illusion. To keep the German bombers from identifying the crossing points, Soviet engineers built bridges that sat just inches below the water's surface. From a reconnaissance plane, the river appeared empty, the current flowing undisturbed, while beneath the ripples, entire divisions were marching toward the front. Radio silence was absolute. High-level commanders communicated through hand-delivered notes and buried telephone lines to ensure the German signals intelligence heard nothing but the static of the winter wind. In the city, the Soviet 62nd Army continued its desperate, bloody defense, acting as the perfect bait to keep General Paulus and his 6th Army focused on a few ruined warehouses while the real threat gathered in the empty spaces to the north and south. The Germans were not just blind, they were willfully ignorant. Their intelligence reports suggested the Soviets were incapable of a major offensive, believing the Red Army had exhausted its last reserves of manpower. When aerial photographs occasionally showed small signs of movement, they were dismissed as minor reinforcements intended to keep the city from falling. This arrogance was the fatal flaw that the Soviet Stavka, led by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, exploited with cold precision. They were not just hiding soldiers, they were hiding an entire war. While the German soldiers huddled in their foxholes, complaining about the lice and the lack of winter gear, they had no idea that 60 divisions were currently breathing in the dark just beyond the ridge, waiting for the signal to pounce. The tension during these weeks was thick enough to touch. Every Soviet soldier involved in the secret movement knew that a single mistake, a single light switched on at 2 a.m., or a single radio transmission could betray the entire operation and lead to a massacre. Yet, the secret held. It was a testament to the iron will of a people who had been pushed to the very edge of extinction. They were no longer fighting for a city or a leader. They were fighting for the right to exist, and they used the shadows of the Russian winter as their greatest weapon. Maskirovka was the art of making the enemy believe what they wanted to believe, and the Germans wanted to believe they had already won. As the middle of November approached, the trap was set. The Soviet troops, hidden in their frozen burrows, could hear the distant rumble of the fighting in the city, a constant reminder of what was at stake. They waited in the bitter cold, often without fires to avoid detection, their breath frosting on the steel of their rifles. The realization that they had surrounded an entire empire began to dawn on the commanders as the final pieces clicked into place. They were the ghosts of the steppe, and they were about to become the nightmare of the Third Reich. The legacy of this moment is not just found in the tactical success of Operation Uranus, but in the profound psychological shift it represented. It was the moment the hunter became the hunted, where the supposed masters of mobile warfare were outplayed by a force they had dismissed as primitive. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the theater of war, what you cannot see is often far more lethal than what you can. The silent buildup across the Volga was the funeral march of the German Sixth Army, played on muffled drums in the dead of night. It remains a testament to the power of silence, the strength of secrecy, and the terrifying resolve of those who wait in the shadows for the perfect moment to strike. When the storm finally broke, it did not just destroy an army, it washed away the myth of invincibility, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth that even the greatest empires can be buried in the snows of their own hubris. The lesson of the Volga is that the most dangerous enemy is the one you have already forgotten to fear. In the vast frozen silence of late 1942, the Soviet Union proved that survival is a game of patience and that the ultimate victory belongs to those who can master the dark before the dawn. As the first shells finally began to fall, the invaders realized too late that the graveyard they had created was not for the Russians, but for themselves. November 19, 1942. In the fog-shrouded steppes northwest of Stalingrad, the pre-dawn stillness was shattered by the roar of 3,500 Soviet guns. This was the opening movement of Operation Uranus, a masterstroke of strategic deception led by Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. While General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army were bleeding out in the pulverized ruins of Stalingrad, obsessed with capturing every last cellar and factory floor, the Soviet High Command was looking far beyond the city limits. They had identified a fatal weakness in the German line, a vulnerability born of Adolf Hitler's overconfidence and the sheer exhaustion of the Wehrmacht's overextended resources. To the north and south of the city, the flanks of the German advance were held not by battle-hardened panzer divisions, but by the under-equipped and overstretched Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. These men had been tasked with holding a front hundreds of miles long with little more than bolt-action rifles and obsolete horse-drawn artillery. They lacked the heavy anti-tank weapons necessary to stop a modern armored assault, and they were painfully aware of their isolation. Despite frantic warnings from Romanian commanders about the massive Soviet buildup across the river, the German High Command remained dismissive. They believed the Red Army was a spent force, incapable of a large-scale offensive after the crushing defeats of the summer. This arrogance blinded the German leadership to the gathering storm. The Soviets had mastered the art of Moskitoovka, or military deception. Under the cover of darkness and the blinding snow of late autumn, they moved over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of aircraft into position, without the Germans ever realizing the scale of the threat. Bridges were built just beneath the surface of the water to hide them from aerial reconnaissance, and radio silence was strictly maintained across all sectors. When the barrage finally lifted at 8,048 a.m, the Soviet infantry and T-34 tanks surged forward through the thick fog. The Romanian lines did not just beat, they disintegrated. In many sectors, the defense collapsed within hours. Romanian soldiers found themselves facing a mechanical tidal wave, left to fight steel monsters with nothing but grenades and desperation. By 2 p.m., the breakthrough was total. Soviet tanks were racing deep into the rear of the German front, targeting command posts and supply depots. As the Soviet pincers began to swing shut from the north and south, a chilling realization began to spread through the German ranks inside Stalingrad. This was no longer a battle for a city. It was a battle for survival. The Sixth Army was being transformed from the predator into the prey. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had exploited the hubris of the Nazi leadership, using the very vastness of the Russian landscape that the Germans sought to conquer as the walls of a colossal prison. The strategy was a surgical strike against the weakest links of the Axis coalition. While the German soldiers in the city center remained focused on street-to-street fighting, the very ground beneath their feet was being cut away. The Romanian troops, often undersupplied and undervalued by their allies, bore the brunt of a Soviet rage that had been building for 18 months. By 4 p.m., on the second day of the offensive, the Soviet forces from the north and south were rapidly closing the distance. The trap was not just a military maneuver, It was a psychological blow that shattered the German belief in their own tactical superiority. The legacy of this maneuver remains one of the most stark examples of how the tides of history can turn on a single oversight. The Romanian soldiers, often scapegoated by German historians after the war, were victims of a command structure that refused to acknowledge the reality of its own overextension. The tragedy of the Eastern Front is often told through the lens of shifting maps, but at its heart, it was a collision of human urence and systemic failure. The Soviet Union had evolved from a broken giant into a precision-engineered machine of war. The encirclement at Stalingrad did more than just trap 300,000 men in a pocket of ice and fire. It broke the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Soviet Union possessed a strategic depth and a resilience that the Third Reich had never accounted for. In the frozen silence that followed the initial breakthrough, the world began to realize that the German tide had reached its high-water mark. The echoes of the artillery on that November morning served as a death knell for the Nazi vision of a 1,000-year empire. History would remember the bravery of those who fought, but it would also remember the cold, calculating genius of those who saw the weakness in the armor of their oppressors. The road to Berlin began here, in the mud and the blood of the dawn, where a forgotten enemy rose from the snow to reclaim its destiny. This moment was the ultimate proof that in the game of total war, the cost of underestimating an opponent is total annihilation. November 19, 1942. On the desolate wind-swept steppes northwest of Stalingrad, the world remained suspended in a thick, bone-chilling fog that swallowed the horizon and muffled the sounds of a gathering storm. For the soldiers of the Romanian Third Army, stationed in thin lines along the Don River, the morning was just another exercise in Uranus against a brutal Russian winter. They shivered in their shallow trenches, clutching thin coats and outdated rifles, unaware that they were standing directly in the path of a tidal wave that had been months in the making. At 7:20 a.m., the silence of the dawn was obliterated by a sound so profound it felt as though the earth itself was being torn asunder. This was the voice of the god of war, the Soviet artillery, announcing the commencement of Operation Uranus with a fury that defied human description. 3,500 guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along a narrow front. The barrage was not a rhythmic pounding, but a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through the frozen ground for miles in every direction. The Katyushas, known to the Germans as Stalin's organs, screeched through the gray sky, leaving trails of white smoke that mirrored the chaotic energy of the Soviet resolve. For 80 minutes, the Romanian positions were transformed into a landscape of fire, iron, and splintered earth. The shells did not just destroy bunkers and wire entanglements, they pulverized the very will of the defenders. Men who had survived years of combat found themselves reduced to a state of primal terror, buried alive in their dugouts or deafened by the relentless concussions that turned the atmosphere into a physical weight. At 8:50 a.m., as the echoes of the last salvos still hung in the heavy, sulphurous air, the ground began to tremble once more. This time, it was not the impact of shells, but the rhythmic churning of thousands of steel tank tracks. Out of the mist emerged the terrifying silhouettes of the 5th Tank Army and the 21st Army. The T-34 tanks, painted white to blue with the snow, looked like ghosts rising from the earth to reclaim the land. Behind them, waves of Soviet infantry surged forward, their voices rising in a collective shout of hurrah that drowned out the whistling wind. The Romanian lines, already broken by the artillery, stood little chance against this mechanized juggernaut. They had no heavy anti-tank weapons capable of stopping the Soviet armor, and their pleas for German reinforcements went unanswered as communication lines were severed within minutes of the initial assault. By 2 p.m., the Soviet breakthrough was absolute. The northern pincer of the encirclement was no longer a theoretical plan on a map. It was a physical reality cutting through the Axis rear. Soviet tanks bypassed pockets of resistance, focused on their objective of racing toward the town of Kalak. The speed of the advance caught the German high command in a state of paralysis. General Paulus, deep inside the ruins of Stalingrad, received reports of a massive Soviet offensive but struggled to comprehend the scale. He had been told the Red Army was a spent force, a broken remnant capable only of small, desperate counterattacks. Now, he was watching as the very ground beneath his feet shifted. The hunters were rapidly becoming the hunted. The legacy of that morning is one of total transformation in the nature of the conflict. It was the moment the myth of German invincibility was not just challenged, but shattered on a structural level. The soldiers who charged across the Don were not just fighting for a city or a river, they were reclaiming the soul of their nation from an invader that had deemed them subhuman. The tragedy of the Romanian and German forces who fell that day serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of strategic arrogance. When a commander looks at a map and sees only lines and numbers, he forgets the human spirit's capacity to yearn the impossible and strike back with a vengeance that can change the course of history. The snow of the dawn became a shroud for an old world order, and as the pincer closed, the shadow of the Red Army began its long, inexorable march toward the heart of the Reich. This was more than a battle. It was the birth of a new reality, where the oppressed finally became the masters of their own fate, leaving behind a legacy of fire and ice that would echo through the centuries. In the cold light of that November day, the German Sixth Army was not just surrounded by soldiers, but by the weight of their own miscalculations and the unstoppable momentum of a people who refused to be conquered. November 20, 1942, on the desolate expanses south of Stalingrad, the second act of the Soviet counteroffensive began with a violent punctuation of fire. As the morning sun struggled to pierce a thick, freezing fog, the Stalingrad front unleashed its fury. This was the southern pincer of Operation Uranus, a strategic masterpiece designed to entrap the German Sixth Army in a pocket of its own making. The primary targets were the overextended units of the Romanian Fourth Army, a force that had been left to guard the vital southern flank with meager equipment and almost no effective anti-tank weaponry. While the world watched the ruins of the city, the real fate of the war was being decided here, on the open, windswept steppe where there was nowhere to hide. At 8 a.m., the Soviet artillery began its work. The shells whistled through the frigid air, turning the iron-hard ground into a chaotic landscape of mud, ice, and fire. For the Romanian soldiers huddled in their shallow, frost-bitten trenches, the barrage was more than a physical assault. It was the psychological realization that they had been abandoned in a landscape that offered no mercy and no retreat. By 10 a.m., the first waves of Soviet infantry emerged from the mist, supported by the terrifying low-slung silhouettes of T-34 tanks. These machines did not merely move across the terrain, they dominated it, their wide tracks allowing them to glide over the snow while the few Romanian anti-tank guns proved tragically useless against their sloped armor. The Romanian 6 and 7 Corps attempted to hold their ground, but the sheer weight of the Soviet momentum was irresistible. By 1 p.m., the thin front lines had been utterly bypassed. Soviet armored units, including the 4th Mechanized Corps and the 13th Tank Corps, were not interested in protracted trench warfare or the clearing of individual bunkers. They were racing for the rear, their objective being the town of Kalok and the vital bridge over the Don River. The speed of the advance was so great that German command centers miles behind the lines were being overrun before they could even send a distress signal. The 51st and 57th Armies moved like a tidal wave, washing over the Romanian positions and leaving behind a trail of broken equipment and demoralized prisoners. In the city of Stalingrad itself, General Paulus and his staff were initially slow to grasp the magnitude of the disaster unfolding to their south. They viewed the early reports of breakthroughs as local setbacks that could be stabilized with small reserve units. But the reserves were a myth, a product of maps that did not reflect the reality of the losses sustained over the previous months. The German 29th Motorized Division, which was supposed to act as the theater fire brigade, found itself swamped by a sea of Soviet armor and unable to coordinate a coherent defense. By 4 p.m., on that first day, the Romanian Fourth Army had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Thousands of men were streaming westward in a panicked retreat, while thousands more were being cut down in the open fields. As night fell, the temperatures plummeted further, but the Soviet drive did not slow for the darkness. The tank crews, fueled by the adrenaline of the hunt and the deep-seated desire for vengeance, pushed their machines through the freezing gloom. By the morning of November 21, the southern and northern pincers were sensing each other across the narrowing gap of the steppe. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht and the spearhead of the invasion, was now a massive, immobile beast that had been outmaneuvered by the very people it sought to enslave. The realization began to dawn on the German officers that they were no longer the ones laying siege to a city. They were the ones under siege in a tomb of snow. The final closure of the trap occurred on November 23rd near the town of Kalach. When the Soviet soldiers of the northern and southern pincers finally met, they fired green flares into the sky and embraced, knowing they had achieved the impossible. They had surrounded nearly 300,000 Axis troops in a pocket that the Germans would soon call the Kessel, or the Cauldron. The momentum of the war had shifted forever in a few days of concentrated, brutal action. The hunters had become the prey, and the vast, unforgiving steppe had become their prison. This moment in history remains a testament to the resilience of a nation that had been pushed to the very edge of existence. The breakthrough across the frozen steppe was not just a military success. It was a profound psychological turning point that shattered the myth of German invincibility. It was the moment the world realized that the tide of the greatest conflict in human history had finally turned. The legacy of those days is one of immense sacrifice and the brutal clarity of total war. It reminds us that no empire is too large to fall, and no army is too powerful to be undone by its own hubris. In the silence that followed the collapse of the Romanian lines, one could almost hear the heartbeat of a continent shifting. The Red Army had not just won a battle, they had reclaimed their future from the jaws of annihilation, leaving behind a frozen graveyard that would serve as a permanent warning to any who would dare to underestimate the spirit of a people fighting for their very survival. The embers of Stalingrad would burn for months, but the flame of the Reich had already begun to flicker out in the cold, howling winds of the Russian winter. November 23, 1942, near the village of Kalach-na-Donu, the horizon was no longer a line of hope for the German invader, but a tightening noose of Soviet steel. Under a sky the color of lead, the rhythmic clatter of T-34 tracks echoed across the steppe, signaling the Yevon era. The pincer movement of Operation Uranus was reaching its long-awaited climax. From the north, the 26th Tank Corps surged forward, their engines straining against the sub-zero temperatures, while from the south, the 4th Mechanized Corps pushed with equal ferocity. There were two arms of a giant closing around the throat of the Wehrmacht. At 3:30 p.m., the first scouts from both Soviet fronts caught sight of one another across the rolling, snow-dusted hills. There was a brief, heart-stopping pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. In the blurred vision of a gathering snowstorm, identification was difficult, and for a moment, the crews feared a friendly fire catastrophe. But then, the prearranged signals flared into the darkening sky, green and red lights cutting through the gray gloom. The soldiers did not merely meet, they collided in a frenzy of triumph. They danced on the frozen hulls of their tanks, sharing coarse tobacco and news of the breakthrough. They knew, perhaps better than the generals in Moscow or Berlin, that the war had just turned a corner from which there was no returning. The bridge at Kalach, captured in a daring night raid just hours earlier by the 26th Tank Corps, served as the physical anchor of this new reality. As the Soviet units linked up, they effectively sealed the fate of 250,000 men. This was the birth of the Kessel, the Great Cauldron, a vast expanse of frozen wasteland that would become a collective tomb for the finest divisions Hitler had ever fielded. Inside the pocket, the German Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the invasion, was now a headless beast. General Paulus, isolated in his bunker, watched as the red lines on his maps finally connected, turning his world into an island of despair in a sea of Soviet red. The air inside the Kessel grew thin with the scent of impending doom. As night fell at 5 p.m., the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl with a predatory hunger. The German soldiers, many still dressed in the summer uniforms they had worn during the glory days of the summer advance, looked toward the west with hollow eyes. They were looking for the flash of friendly artillery or the silhouettes of a relief force that Hitler had promised would come. But the only light they saw was the constant flickering pulse of the Soviet Katyusha rockets, illuminating the snow in hellish shades of crimson. This encirclement was not merely a tactical victory. It was a psychological shattering of the myth of German invincibility. The Blitzkrieg had met its match in the grinding, industrial Uranus of the Soviet spirit. The Red Army had learned the hard lessons of 1941 and had applied them with a mathematical, cold-blooded precision. They had allowed the Germans to overextort, to bleed themselves white in the ruins of a city that had become a meat grinder. And then they had struck where the enemy was weakest, shattering the Romanian and Italian flanks. By 7:15 p.m., the commanders of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts were able to report to Stalin that the ring was ironclad. The legacy of that afternoon at Kalash reverberates through the decades as a testament to the unpredictable nature of total war. It stands as a grim reminder that the height of a conqueror's pride is often the very moment before their precipitous fall. The soldiers who embraced on the bridge that day were not just celebrating a local victory. They were marking the beginning of the long, bloody march to Berlin. They had transformed the frozen steppe into a crucible where the destiny of Europe was being reforged in fire and ice. As we look back at the meeting of those tank brigades, we see more than just a maneuver on a map. We see the heavy cost of hubris and the terrifying resilience of a people pushed to the edge of extinction. The Kessel at Stalingrad remains a poignant symbol of the human capacity for both immense suffering and incredible triumph. It is a story written in the frost of a Russian winter, a narrative of 250,000 souls lost to the ambitions of a madman, and the dawning realization that the tides of history are as indifferent as the cold wind blowing across the dawn. The ring was closed, the trap was set, and the silence that followed was the heaviest sound in the world. November 23, 1942, and E-42, inside the command bunker at Golubinsky. General Friedrich Paulus stared at the radiograms that confirmed his worst fears. The pincers of the Red Army had met at Kalash, and the Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now a prisoner within the very city it had spent months trying to conquer. The transition from besieger to besieged did not happen with a sudden explosion, but with a creeping glacial terror that set in as the sun dipped below the horizon at 4 p.m. over the frozen Volga. For weeks, the German soldiers had looked at the shattered remains of Stalingrad as a prize to be seized. Now, those same ruins were a graveyard. Paulus, a man of meticulous detail and rigid adherence to the chain of command, found himself paralyzed by conflicting realities. To his front, the ruins were infested with Soviet snipers. To his rear, a vast, empty expanse of snow-covered steppe occupied by 3 Soviet army groups. The sound of the Soviet Katyusha rockets, which the Germans called Stalin's organs, became the constant soundtrack to a nightmare from which there was no waking. In Berlin, the atmosphere was delusional. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had brashly promised the Führer that his planes could fly in 500 tons of supplies every day to sustain the 250,000 men trapped in the pocket. It was a mathematical impossibility that Paulus understood immediately. At 9 a.m. the following morning, the first transport planes attempted to pierce the Soviet ring. They were met not by clear skies, but by a wall of anti-aircraft fire in the relentless Russian winter. The Ju-52 transport planes, the Iron Annie workhorses of the German Air Force, were falling from the sky like burning leaves. By early December, the daily tonnage delivered was barely reaching a fraction of what was needed. Instead of the promised 500 tons, the soldiers were lucky to see 80 tons of bread, ammunition, and fuel. The air bridge was not a lifeline, it was a fraying thread. Soldiers who had once dreamt of victory now spent their hours scavenging for frozen horse carcasses buried in the snow. The horses of the Sixth Army, once the backbone of their mobility, were being eaten until there were no horses left. The psychological shift inside the Kessel was profound. The German soldier had been told he was part of an invincible machine. Yet here he was, shivering in a hole in the ground, watching his toes turn black with frostbite while his stomach shriveled from hunger. Palace waited for a breakout order that never came. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic value of the city bearing Stalin's name, ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast. He promised that General von Manstein and the 4th Panzer Army would punch through from the south. At 2 p.m. on a particularly bleak afternoon in mid-December, the men in the pocket heard the distant thunder of Manstein's panzers. Operation Winter Storm was underway. For a brief moment, hope flared. Men who could barely stand leaned on their rifles and looked toward the horizon, praying for the sight of German steel. But the relief force stalled 30 miles away, unable to break the Soviet grip. Pallas, ever the loyal officer, refused to break out without a direct order from Hitler, an order that was denied. The distance between the rescuers and the rescued might as well have been the distance between the Earth and the Moon. The failure of the air bridge and the collapse of the relief effort signaled the end of any rational hope. The sky, which was supposed to bring salvation, brought only the occasional drop of supplies that often landed in Soviet territory or smashed into the frozen earth. The German army was learning a bitter lesson about the vastness of Russia and the limits of their own logistics. The hunters were now starving in their own traps. The legacy of these weeks remains one of the most sobering chapters in human conflict. It is a testament to how quickly the arrogance of an empire can be humbled by the indifferent forces of geography and weather. The men of the Sixth Army were left to rot in the cold, abandoned by the leadership that had led them to the gates of the city. As the snow continued to fall, covering the living and the dead alike, the realization settled over the ruins. The tide of the entire war had shifted. The shadow of Stalingrad would loom over the rest of the 20th century, reminding the world that no machine is truly invincible, and that the cost of hubris is always paid in the blood of those left behind in the cold. The silence of the steppe had become a monument to a catastrophe that would never be forgotten. December 12, 1942. On the desolate, windswept plains southwest of Stalingrad, the grinding roar of Tiger tanks signaled the start of a desperate gamble. General Erich von Manstein had launched Operation Winter Storm, a final attempt to break the Soviet encirclement and rescue the trapped Sixth Army. Inside the pocket, the news of the approaching relief force spread through the freezing trenches like a fever. Men who had been living on horsehide and frozen breadcrumbs suddenly found the strength to stand. At night, the soldiers climbed onto the rubble of the ruined city and looked toward the southwest, watching for the distant, rhythmic pulses of light on the horizon. By December 19, the relief force was a mere 30 miles away, close enough that the trapped German soldiers claimed they could hear the muffled thud of their comrades' artillery. It was the moment of truth. Manstein sent a message to General Friedrich Paulus, urging him to execute Operation Thunderclap, a full-scale breakout. But Paulus, paralyzed by his sense of duty and the command to hold the Volga at all costs, hesitated. He argued that his tanks lacked the fuel to travel even 30 miles. The window of salvation remained open for just a few days before the Soviet High Command reacted with overwhelming force, slamming the door shut and pushing Manstein back into retreat. The flicker of hope on the horizon vanished, leaving the Sixth Army alone in an icy tomb. By the time January 1943 arrived, the German Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force, but a collection of walking ghosts. The Luftwaffe, promised to fly in 500 tons of supplies daily, had proved to be a lethal fantasy. In reality, the transport planes often managed less than 80 tons, and the cargo they delivered was frequently absurd. While the men starved, they opened crates to find thousands of condoms or tons of marjoram and pepper, supplies that were useless against the 60 below zero temperatures. Hunger became a more persistent enemy than the Soviet snipers. The horses were long gone, and the men had begun to scour the frozen earth for anything organic. Every morning, the soldiers would drag the bodies of their comrades out of the bunkers, stacking them like cordwood because the ground was too hard to dig graves. Frostbite turned limbs black, and without medicine, thousands simply waited in the basements of a city they had once hoped to conquer. On January 10, 1943, at 8 a.m., the silence of the steppe was shattered by the roar of 7,000 Soviet guns. This was Operation Ring, the final liquidation of the pocket. The Soviet Red Army, now well-fed and possessing an almost inexhaustible supply of ammunition, pressed inward from all sides. The German perimeter began to collapse. One by one, the vital airfields were overrun. On January 16, the main airfield at Potomnik fell, and on January 25th, the last remaining strip at Gumrak was lost. The last Junkers transport plane took off under a hail of Soviet fire, leaving thousands of wounded men on the runway, begging not to be left behind. The pocket was split in two, and the German soldiers were forced into the skeletal remains of the city center. Inside the damp basement of the Univermag department store, General Paulus sat in a state of near-total collapse. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power, Hitler sent a final radio message to the city. He promoted Paulus to the rank of Generalfeld Marshal. It was a cynical gesture, as no German field marshal had ever been taken alive. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to commit suicide. However, the newly minted field marshal looked at the starving men around him and decided he would not take his own life for a leader who had so utterly betrayed them. On January 31st, Soviet troops reached the department store. A young Soviet officer entered the basement and found the German high command waiting in the shadows. There was no grand ceremony, only the quiet, hollow surror of a man who had lost everything. 2 days later, the northern pocket also capitulated, and the guns of Stalingrad went silent. The human cost of this slaughter is almost impossible to comprehend. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had entered the pocket, only 91,000 remained to be marched away into the frozen depths of Soviet captivity. They were led out in long, ragged columns, a procession of misery that stretched across the white horizon. Of those 91,000, only 6,000 would survive the labor camps to return to Germany years after the war had ended. Stalingrad was the death of an army, but it was also the death of an era. It was the moment the tide turned irrevocably against the Third Reich, proving that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the sheer, grinding weight of a nation determined to defend its soil. The city on the Volga became a mass grave for the hubris of an empire. Today, the earth still occasionally reveals the rusted steel and bleached bone of that winter, serving as a poignant reminder of the cost of total war. The legacy of the battle is a permanent scar on the history of the 20th century, a testament to the fact that when the machinery of war finally breaks, all that is left is the cold wind of the steppe and the memory of those who were sacrificed in the snow. The victory was total. The defeat was absolute, and the world would never be the same again. The silence that followed the final shot was the loudest sound in the history of the war, echoing the realization that the road to Berlin had finally been paved in the ashes of the Sixth Army. February 2nd, 1943, in the skeletal remains of a city that had ceased to exist, the final shots of the most apocalyptic battle in human history sputtered out. At 10 a.m., that morning, the guns went quiet, leaving behind a stillness so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the chests of the survivors. For months, the world had watched this be in the Volga River, convinced it was the altar upon which the Soviet Union would be sacrificed. Instead, it became the grave of the Wehrmacht's leg of invincibility. The soldiers of the Red Army, who had once been pushed back to the very edge of the water, stood amidst the rubble and realized they had not just survived, they had consumed the pride of the German military. Operation Uranus had been a masterstroke of deception, but the reality of its success was something neither side could have fully grasped as the trap snapped shut in November. By the time the winter sun set on the final German Führer, the Sixth Army, once the vanguard of Hitler's unstoppable conquest, had been reduced to a shivering, starving mass of 91,000 prisoners. As these men were marched away into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet interior, the realization began to dawn on the world that the tide of the Second World War had not just shifted, it had fundamentally broken. The ghost of Stalingrad does not just haunt the ruins or the memorials that now stand upon the Mamayev Kurgan. It haunts the very concept of modern warfare. It was here that the industrialized slaughter reached its terrifying zenith, where the individual human life was reduced to a mere statistic in a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. The Soviet victory was bought with the blood of over 1 million of its own people, a cost so high that it redefined the meaning of sacrifice. For the German people, the news of the defeat was a catastrophic blow to the psyche of the nation. On the day the news was officially released in Berlin, a state of mourning was declared, but no amount of ceremony could mask the truth that the German army was now a force in retreat, destined to be hunted all the way back to the Reichstag. The legacy of the Eastern Front is a tapestry of iron and bone. Even today, the spring thaw in the fields surrounding the city reveals the remnants of those who fell. Rusted helmets, shattered rifles, and the remains of young men from villages thousands of miles apart lie tangled together in the earth. This is the Uran carnage of the conflict, a permanent scar on the geography of Eurasia. Stalingrad was the moment the Soviet Union transformed into a global superpower, forged in the fires of a total war that demanded everything and spared nothing. The Red Army that emerged from the rubble was no longer the disorganized force of 1941. It was a hardened, vengeful machine, fueled by the memory of the horrors witnessed in the ruins of the tractor factory and the grain elevator. As we look back through the fog of decades, the battle stands as a monument to the resilience of the human spirit and the terrifying depths of human cruelty. It was a clash of two ideologies that viewed the world in absolute terms, leaving no room for compromise or mercy. The soldiers who fought there, whether they wore the gray of the Wehrmacht or the olive drab of the Red Army, were caught in a storm that defied logic. For many, the war ended in Stalingrad, regardless of whether they survived the fighting. The psychological trauma of the Cauldron, the Kessel, remained with the survivors until their final days, a shadow that never lifted. The turning tide at Stalingrad was the beginning of the Third Reich. It proved that the Blitzkrieg could be halted by grit, that the master race could be outthought and outfought by those they deemed inferior, and that geography could be turned into a weapon more lethal than any tank. The road to Berlin was long and paved with countless more tragedies, but the direction of that road was set in the red snow of the Volga. Ultimately, the ghost of Stalingrad is a warning. It is a reminder of what happens when the machinery of state and the ideology of hate are allowed to run unchecked to their logical conclusion. It is a story of a city that was destroyed to save it, and 1 million lives that were spent to turn the page of history. As the wind blows across the steppe today, it carries the echoes of a conflict that changed the world forever. The silence that remains is not just the absence of noise, but a profound, heavy meditation on the price of victory. In the Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the hinge of fate, a place where the future of the world was decided in the ruins of the past. The lesson of those months of agony is that, while empires may rise on the strength of their steel, they fall when they lose their humanity in the pursuit of total power. The snow has long since melted, and the city has been rebuilt. But the earth remembers. It remembers the bravery, the terror, and the absolute finality of the moment when the hunters became the hunted.